Hey everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel Physio's Healing Touch. So I hope you do phenomenal in your life, and today this video is going to be on stretching. So I will cover all those muscles, all those intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of hand. That means those muscles that perform extension and flexion of wrist joint, abduction, adduction, flexion, extension of metacarpophalangeal joints, and flexion, extension of interphalangeal joints. So all those muscles I will cover in this video. If you want more such stretching videos of neck muscles, upper limb muscles, lower limb muscles, then I will link those videos in the description box, or you can check the playlist where you will find all my stretching videos. So without any further delay, let's start this video. So first I will tell you all the muscles that belongs to the flexor group, and then I will cover the extensor group. So the first extrinsic muscle of hand is flexor carpi radialis. So as the name itself suggests, at the wrist joint, it helps in flexion of wrist joint and it helps in radial deviation of wrist joint. And at the elbow joint, it assists in flexion of elbow joint and it helps in pronation. So if we want to stretch this muscle, we will perform just opposite of these functions. So that's why we are doing just opposite of that function. We are extending the elbow and I have done supination of forearm. And then I will perform ulnar deviation and wrist extension in order to stretch that muscle. Now the next extrinsic muscle is flexor carpi ulnaris. Now the function is just like flexor carpi radialis, but in this it assists in ulnar deviation. The flexor carpi radialis was assisting in radial deviation of wrist, but flexor carpi ulnaris assists in flexion of wrist joint but ulnar deviation of wrist joint. So to stretch this muscle, we will perform just opposite of these functions. So I am doing just opposite of those functions. I am radially deviating the wrist as well as I am extending the wrist. Now the next muscle is Palmaris longus. This muscle is absent in a small percentage of population, and the function of this muscle is it helps in flexion at the wrist joint, and it also helps in tensing the palmar aponeurosis which is present here. So it also helps in tensing that aponeurosis. So to stretch this muscle, we will perform just opposite of this function. Now to stretch palmaris longus, I will extend the wrist joint because it helps in flexion. So I will extend the wrist as well as metacarpophalangeal joints. Now the next extrinsic muscle is flexor digitorum superficialis. Now the function of this muscle is at wrist joint, it helps in flexion of the wrist joint. At the metacarpophalangeal joints, these are the MCP joints, so it helps in flexion of the metacarpophalangeal joints, and at the proximal interphalangeal joints. So these are the proximal interphalangeal joint and this is the distal interphalangeal joints. But flexor digitorum superficialis only act at proximal interphalangeal joints, so it helps in flexion of the proximal interphalangeal joints as well. Don't get confused between flexor digitorum superficialis and flexor digitorum profundus. In flexor digitorum profundus, it also acts at DIP joints, that means distal phalangeal joints. So it also flexes the DIP joint, but the flexor digitorum superficialis does not act at DIP joint or distal phalangeal joints, and this difference is because of their insertion points. They have different insertion points. So basically in this hand, this is wrist joint. So this is a wrist joint. These are MCP joints, metacarpophalangeal joints, and these are PIP joints, that means proximal interphalangeal joints, and these are DIP joints, yani ki distal interphalangeal joints. Now to stretch flexor superficialis, I will extend the wrist joint, I will extend the metacarpophalangeal joints, I will extend the proximal interphalangeal joints, but I will not stretch the DIP joints. These are the DIP joints. So I will not stretch or extend the DIP joint, because if I will extend the DIP joint, it will actually stretch the flexor digitorum profundus muscle. So I will let these DIP joints remain flexed. So I will stretch like this. In this way, the wrist joint is extending and the MCP and proximal interphalangeal joints are also extending, but the DIP joints are remain flexed. Now to stretch the profundus muscle, now I will also extend the DIP joints, because it also helps in flexing the DIP joints. So I will stretch like this. I will extend the wrist joint and I will also extend all the MCP, PIP and DIP joints. So I will stretch it like this. It does not act at thumb joint, and that's why I am not extending that. Now I will cover flexor group of thumb. So the first muscle will be flexor pollicis longus. So this is also an extrinsic muscle and it helps in wrist flexion as well as flexion of thumb. Now to stretch the flexor pollicis longus, I need to extend the wrist as well as thumb joint. I will perform it like this. I will extend the thumb as well as wrist. Now the flexor group is over, and now I will tell you about the extensor group of hand. Stretching is very easy to remember. You just need to know the functions of that particular muscles, and once you know the function of that muscle, then for stretching you just need to reverse those functions. The first muscle of extensor group is extensor digitorum. So this muscle helps in extension of wrist joint as well as extension of phalanges. Extensor digitorum act at second, third, fourth and fifth phalanges. It does not act at thumb joint. The muscles of the thumb are different from the other phalanges. Now to stretch the extensor digitorum, you need to grasp the fingers like this and then flex them all. In this way, it will stretch that extensor digitorum muscle. Extensor carpi radialis. The function of extensor carpi radialis, it at wrist joint, it helps in wrist extension as well as it radially deviates the wrist, and at the elbow joint it is also a weak elbow flexor. Now to perform extensor carpi radialis stretching, you have to perform ulnar deviation and then you need to flex it. So you need to perform it like this: ulnar deviation and flexion of wrist. Now the next muscle is extensor carpi ulnaris, and the function of this is it helps in wrist extension as well as it ulnarly deviates the wrist. So for this you need to perform radial deviation of wrist and then flexion of wrist. So it will be like this. Now the next muscle is extensor digiti minimi. So as the name suggests, minimi, so it helps in extension of little finger as well as extension of wrist joint. Now to stretch the extensor digiti minimi, you need to flex the wrist joint and little finger both. So you need to grasp the little finger like this and then you need to flex it as well as the wrist joint. Now the next muscle is extensor pollicis longus. So this muscle basically helps in extension of thumb as well as extension of wrist joint, and this muscle is basically situated somewhat here, so that's why this muscle also helps in radial deviation. Now to stretch extensor pollicis longus, I need to flex the thumb and slightly perform ulnar deviation as well as flex the wrist joint. So it will be like this.
So you need to grasp the thumb like this and then you have to perform the flexion movement. So you have to flex the thumb and then ulnarly deviate the wrist. And at the same time you need to flex the wrist joint. So all the three movements are taking place at the same time.
Now the next muscle is extensor pollicis brevis. The previous one was extensor pollicis longus, but this muscle is extensor pollicis brevis. The function of this muscle is to abduct as well as to extend the thumb joint. This muscle, extensor pollicis brevis, has a weak ability to abduct the thumb as well. Now, to stretch the extensor pollicis brevis, the function of this muscle is to extend and abduct the thumb. So what I will do is I will flex and adduct the thumb, and I will also perform the ulnar deviation because it helps assist in radial deviation. So you can see I am flexing, adducting as well as I am performing ulnar deviation. Now the next muscle is extensor indicis. So this muscle helps in extension of index finger as well as extension of wrist joint. I will perform flexion of wrist and the index finger both. I will grasp the index finger and then I will flex it, and I am also flexing the wrist joint. Now I will cover those muscles that help in abduction and adduction. So the first muscle will be Abductor digiti minimi. This muscle helps in abduction of little finger. So it helps in abduction of little finger. Now to stretch Abductor digiti minimi, what I will do is I will slightly extend the little finger and then I will take it towards the adduction. So in this way it will stretch the abductor digiti minimi. I am just slightly extending it to take it backward and then I will adduct it. Now the next adductor muscle is adductor pollicis. So this muscle is basically situated here, and this muscle helps in adduction of the thumb as well as assist in flexion of the thumb. To stretch adductor pollicis, which is present here, so what I am doing is I am abducting as well as I am extending the thumb, and the muscle which is present here, it will stretch. Now the last two muscles are lumbrical muscles and introsi muscles. So first is lumbrical muscles. So the function of lumbrical muscles at MCP joint, that means metacarpophalangeal joint, is flexion, and at interphalangeal joints its function is extension. So its function is like this: flexion at the MCP joint and extension at the interphalangeal joints. It does not act at thumb, it only acts at second, third, fourth and fifth phalange. Now to stretch the lumbrical muscles, it extends the interphalangeal joints, so that's why I will flex it. At the metacarpophalangeal joints, it actually helps in flexion, so I will extend it. So I will perform it like this. I hope you are able to see. What I am doing is I am extending the metacarpophalangeal joints and I am flexing the interphalangeal joints. Now the next muscle are introsi muscles. So basically it is divided into two: palmar introsi and dorsal introsi. Palmar introsi help in flexion at the MCP joint, extension at the interphalangeal joint, but it also assists in adduction. And the main difference between palmar and dorsal introsi is, in dorsal introsi we perform flexion at the MCP joints and extension at the interphalangeal joints, but it helps in abduction of the fingers. Now to stretch the palmar introsi muscle, first I need to interlock my hand with that of the patient, and then what I will do is I will extend the MTP joints and flex the interphalangeal joints.
In this stretch, you can see I have interlocked my hand with that of the patient, and the reason behind this is because it helps me to keep the patient's finger abducted. Now to stretch dorsal introsi, it helps in abduction of the fingers. So while stretching, I will make sure that my fingers remain adducted, and rest the stretching is same. So you can see I am extending the MCP joints and flexing the interphalangeal joints.
So yeah, that's it for today's video, and I hope this video was helpful, and please share and subscribe to my YouTube channel Physio's Healing Touch. See you in the next video.